Bene.
Very well. Let us resume our proceedings with our second session on data protection and new rights in the digital era. We have three authoritative speakers: Morten Kjaerum, Judge of the Court of Justice of the European Union; Giovanni Buttarelli, Assistant European Data Protection Supervisor; and Guido Scorza, who is a professor at the University of Bologna. And let us now open the session, reminding you that there will be a debate after the presentations. So if you wish to speak during the debate, please fill in the ad hoc forms so that we can draw up a list of all those wishing to take the floor. Before handing over to the first of our keynote speakers, allow me to remind you that the topic at hand is considered a priority by the Italian presidency of the EU. There is no doubt that the development of the use of the internet calls for appropriate safeguards to avoid fraud, abuse, and to guarantee privacy and the rights of users. The transnational nature of the internet, however, calls for an approach that goes beyond national borders. There is a reform package which has been submitted to address this issue, and Europe indeed is in fact spearheading this process. We know that the internet has radically changed the patterns of data exchange. The technological and computer technology developments have had an impact on personal data, privacy, and so on. Hence the need to ensure that all those who collect and process personal data should be responsible for these processes. We know that in the face of sea change in the ICT sector, there is the need to replace bureaucratic protocols with activities that are more focused on the risks deriving from reckless and illicit use of personal data, which can damage our citizens. So the aim is to achieve harmonization in the legal framework using regulations that can be applied in a uniform fashion by member states without the need for international laws. The Italian Chamber of Deputies, and this was pointed out by Ms. Baldrini, the Italian Chamber of Deputies has set up an ad hoc working group to examine the guarantees, rights and duties for the use of the internet, and a draft of the committee's proposal has been circulated as a basic working paper. Our hope is that in the course of today's meeting we will be able to contribute to the development of adequate legislation. We need to guarantee personal data protection under the oversight of competent authorities. We will have to also look at the point of view of this from the point of view of the judiciary and of law enforcement. This short introduction ends here, and I will now hand over to the three keynote speakers who will be addressing specific topics, and each will have 15 minutes. The first is Judge Ilicic, followed by Mr. Buttarelli and Mr. Scorza. Over to you, Mr. Ilicic.
Prego.
Grazie, signora Presidente. Grazie per l'interesse.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this interesting introduction. Well, this is a rare opportunity for me to have an exchange with members of Parliament. We know that only rarely do we have an opportunity to engage with members of Parliament. The judiciary and the legislative bodies are generally separate. I've been told that it's preferable if I use English, which is what I'm going to do, not least because I have prepared a text in English. So I can't use my mother tongue, Slovenian, so it's going to have to be English.
Suppose that the Camera dei Deputati invited me to this meeting because I was reporting judge in the case Google Spain, you may know. And okay, I know a little bit something about the data protection, but perhaps you will be disappointed. I'm not going to talk a lot of this case. As a reporting judge, as a judge in general, you are not, I wouldn't say allowed, but authorized or the best placed person to comment your own judgment. You put down, you wrote down everything you wanted to say. So I perhaps speak a little in a way, in a little more general way, but I couldn't at the end to avoid making some comments on this case. Why? In principle, we know the rule. Nemo iudex in sua propria causa. The judges shouldn't comment their own matters. But as we judges at the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, we are not closed in an ivory tower. We do follow what people think about us. And so we read the comments of journalists, of lawyers, of everybody, of politicians concerning our judgments. And sometimes we see, and we regret it, but perhaps it's our fault, that our judgments are not well understood. So I'll make a little effort to clarify something about creating judgments of the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg. That will be the first part of my short introduction. Then I'll face a little bit the general problematic of human rights protection before our court, and at the end I really concentrate myself on some little issues concerning data protection cases before our court. So I can imagine that you know the role, the function of the Court of Justice of the European Union, but nevertheless I would like to stress some points which perhaps are not that well known, or of which we are not, or you are not, people, politicians, lawyers all over Europe are not that much aware of. It's a court created in 1952 in the community, in the steel and coal community at the time, and its role can be very well illustrated by a quotation. I quote the first president of our court, of the predecessor of our court, Massimo Pilotti, the Italian judge, who quoted his compatriot Dante Alighieri, who wrote in his book, not La Divina Commedia, of course, but it was Monarchia, another political book written in Latin, and he wrote, ubi litigium esse potest, ibi judicium esse debet. Remember, potest debet in Latin, okay, where there is a possibility that a conflict arises, there is an obligation to have a judiciary. And this was the idea. So, unfortunately, in our times, already 62 years, 2 years ago it was the same, you can't avoid conflicts between institutions, between people, between everybody. There is no more golden age, aureatas, the Publius Ovidius Naso, so there must be a judiciary. You like it or not? And is it good or not? Okay, of course, everybody would like that judges decide well, but it doesn't happen at all the times. And there is a big achievement of political and cultural nature in the European Union that you must trust the Court of Justice, knowing that it makes mistake, that judges are human bodies, as you can see. If I don't look too human, I apologize. So, of course, but it is better than have war, than have quarrels between institutions, so you must trust them. And imagine our work, our task is not that easy. We are 28 judges at the court, 28 judges from 28 different states, member countries, and we have to decide in chambers of 3, 5, 15, or even 28 judges. It is quite complicated to reach a judgment, and of course the text of judgments, the final text, is sometimes ambiguous. It's not easy to read, I confess it. I asked the organizers to print you out the case of Google Spain because I wanted to use it like an example, but okay, it doesn't work. Anyhow, I don't have time enough. So, the judgment is always a compromise, as in your political life, which you know better than me. You have to make compromises. Our judgments are also compromises, with a big difference if I compare it with parliamentary or government decisions, that you never know, the outside people never know who voted for what. The deliberation is secret and it remains secret. So in this light, you should look at judgments coming out of our court, also for the Google Spain judgment, which we'll approach a little bit later. Second point. The Court of Justice of the European Union is not a court for human rights. Sometimes people forget it, because we have a special court on human rights in Strasbourg, you know it, which has nothing to do formally with the European Union. It belongs to the Council of Europe. So, and they just defend human rights under the European Convention of Human Rights from 1950, and that is their main task. We do not approach in a general way human rights. But of course, after the inclusion of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union into the primary law of the European Union that happened on the 1st of December 2009, as you know, we have a new source of law which covers the area of human rights in the European Union. And now, be aware of this fact. It was mentioned early this afternoon by the Commissioner I heard, Article 6 of the Treaty on European Union. It speaks about human rights. First paragraph. The human rights as regulated in the Charter of the European Union on Fundamental Rights is one of the general principles of the European law. Paragraph 2. the Union will accede to the European Convention on Human Rights. Paragraph 3, the human rights as expressed in the common constitutional tradition of the members of the European Union are to be respected. Okay, I didn't quote it literally, but this is the sense of this Article 6. So our court has to apply 3 different sources of law: Charter of EU, European Convention on Human Rights, and the national constitutions, or common ideas of national constitutions. That is not an easy work for us. We face it often. I would remind you of the judgment Åkerberg-Fransen from 2013, a Swedish case, when we had to decide whether the Swedish Constitution and the European Convention and our Charter are compatible. It is quite a complicated matter, but I would really don't want to enter it much into it. Yes, also this problem of the accession of the European Union to the European Convention of Human Rights has been faced today before, and it was stressed that our court is in a situation to have to decide whether the draft treaty between the European Union and the Council of Europe concerning human access to the Convention is compatible with the EU law. A demand of the opinion arrived from the European Commission. You will understand the case is pending. Somebody said that the decision will be reached before the end of this year. I'm not that sure about, but it's a secret. But you'll understand that I am going to abstain of commenting a pending case before our court. There are other topics concerning human rights which appear often before our court: asylum case, immigration cases, terrorist cases, right of defense, and so on, but I could speak for the whole day about it, so I'll skip it. And let me turn to the third point, the data protection cases. Let's not forget, the court, as any court in this world, does not choose the cases coming before it itself. It depends on parties or on different persons outside of the court. So we can't really enter into any question in which a parliament could do or a government could do. We are just bound on questions as posed to us. And so in this year, I'm not going to evaluate the importance of these cases, but 2, let's say, bigger or important cases were decided by our court. It was the Digital Rights Ireland judgment from 8th of April of this year, and it was the Google Spain judgment of the 13th of May of this year. And they merit observations from the part of member states and from the part of the European institutions. I'll just comment in 2 sentences the Digital Ireland decision. It invalidated, our court invalidated the Data Retention Directive, if I may abbreviate the title of it, because it imposed or allowed to member states to retain personal data for a certain period, and our court found out that it was not proportionate. And the directive is invalidated, which has a direct impact on the national laws which implemented the directive. The German Constitutional Court decided about the validity of this regime, directive, national law, together before, and there are some countries who reacted very soon afterwards. I can't avoid mentioning the Slovenian Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Court of my home country, which invalidated the Slovenian law concerning the data retention 2 or 3 months after the decision of the Luxembourg Court. It was in mid-July this year. But let me say 2 more words about the Google Spain judgment. I was, as I said, reporting judge. I had a big responsibility. I drafted it after a long discussion with my 14 colleagues. It was the Grand Chamber of the Court, and it is like as it is. So you take it or leave it, but it's imposed to the member countries and to European institutions. There have been hundreds of reactions, public reactions. I haven't read them all, but some of them were very impressive. And I chose to terminate my presentation today a title of one of the articles which was published somewhere, I won't quote it. What did the court really say in this case? Because there are a lot of misunderstandings, and that may be a fault of the court, of the poor drafting. Imagine, you must know it, huh? That we work at the court exclusively in French. Judges just speak French. We draft our text in French, and then when it is translated into other languages, the 23 remaining languages of the European Union, it may lose something. The translation is not an easy task, especially in juridical text. And there were 3 main issues in this case. Okay, it's a long judgment. You can read it at any time at the website of the court in all 23 languages. It concerned, firstly, the territorial application of the European directive. It was Google who was accused to provide for a link to a page in Spain. This was a preliminary ruling from Audiencia Nacional of Spain, and there was a certain person who nowadays is very popular, in spite of the fact that he demanded data protection. This is some kind of paradox, but you can find the name of Mr. Costeja Gonzalez everywhere. So he, 15 years ago, he didn't pay some debts to the Spanish social security, and there was a procedure, and his house was put to an auction, public auction. And after the Spanish law, this auction has to be published in a newspaper called Vanguardia of Barcelona. And it was on the net. And now Google, and now if you type today, Conseja Gonzalez, sur le Google search, all his stories appear, even this one, which has nothing to do with the actual situation of this person. He paid the debts, the case is over. This was the factual background of the case. And then there is no problem. The data, it's personal data, but they were legal. They were legally published. Even the Spanish law demanded that this is public. But of course, it has nothing to do with the actual situation of this person. But Google, as you know, has its seat in California. So is the European law applicable or not? And don't forget, the directive is from 1995, so 19 years old. The expansion of internet at that time was not like today. So we decided finally that the European law is applicable because Google had a subsidiary in Spain. It was Google Spain, but I don't know if there is no subsidiary in Portugal or in Slovenia or in some other country. So I'm not sure, but we decided. We responded to the question. The second problem, whether Google was the operator and whether he processed data, we answered with yes, because it agglomerated the data. You could find all the personal data clicking the name. And this is the very point of the decision, which is not understood. Often not understood. People talk or write about a right to be forgotten. Droit d'oubli, derecho a olvidar. You read, it's not true. We didn't decide that a person, we didn't exclude it, but it was not the case, that a person can demand. There were some examples given this afternoon about children publishing on Facebook or anywhere their naked photos. We didn't decide about this. We don't exclude it, but you must have a look. You must understand the judgment as it is. We decided that Google is not entitled to provide a link to a website information which has been put on the net by a third person. It's not Google which published this story about selling a house of somebody. It's legally published, but you must read the judgment. There is a wording on the basis of search by personal name. So you can, of course, if you search by Vanguardia newspaper, you can have a look of all the publications of this newspaper since 1888, I suppose. It started to be edited. Of course, no problem, but you can't really find it by name. This is just one small part of the problematic of the data protection on the internet. So our court is not that mindful as somebody could imagine. But of course, cases will arrive and arrive. And I am honored, anyhow, that I see that the European community as a community of individuals, has found the judgments important, giving a hint in the direction of better data protections of individuals. But the work is now to be done by others, by the political institutions. We did a little part of the of increasing the data protection, but not anymore. Thank you, my President.
Grazie a lei, veramente.
Thank you very much for having brought us your personal experience and in particular for having managed to give a lot of significance and also provide us with an authentic reading of that sentence and the message contained in it. And now I'd like to give the floor to Giovanni Bottarelli, who is European Deputy Guarantor for Protection of Rights. 15 minutes again.
Dear President Ferranti, dear President Finocchiaro, the style of EU institutions is to use one of the three European Union main languages. But differently from my good colleague Morten Kjaerum, it would be a pity not to make profit of this fantastic translation, and therefore, with your permission, I will move to my native language, Italian. To say that la protezione dei dati.
Protection of personal data is something which is going through a historic phase, something which has defined a moment of truth. In the last 40 years, there have been other critical and important phases in the way in which, at the European Union and at the Council of Europe, an important page in this area has been dealt with, but never like now, after the revelations which we all know of on the intensive and massive surveillance activities and the first considerations on the big data issue. The decisions taken by the European Union and also by the Council of Europe, as we'll be seeing in the coming months, will be extremely important. And so one of the points which is raised is the need for a global response in the digital age, a response which can no longer be entrusted to the approach of individual countries or on the part of individual areas. And here we encounter one of the first areas of difficulty, since the European approach historically has been addressed to protecting individuals rather than consumers. And the goal of the free circulation of data and harmonization are certainly important, but they are not the only goals. In other countries, the system hinges more on individuals as consumers, and there is greater emphasis on the need to facilitate trans-border data flows. In order to face up to this divergence, Europe has begun some time ago to discuss trans-border data flows and identified a number of solutions which are summarized on this slide. There are some more recent exercises which focus on the harmonization of so-called binding corporate rules with the similar binding corporate rules which exist in the APEC area. And there are major efforts to intensify international cooperation between the authorities which oversee privacy and data protection. This is just a summary of some of the recent international instruments which in the OECD and the standards approved by the data protection authorities. The aim is to ensure sufficient guarantees at the international level, and even purely trade agreements such as the GATT also has references on this. Here we need to look at the short-term prospects there which exist in the mother of all conventions which will be discussed in the coming months, the TTIP. Even though it focuses specifically on trade, it might contain important provisions, even though indirectly important, on data protection issues. And whereas some issues like cybercrime, there's been a very rapid procedure of ratification on the part of the member states. The United States ratified this convention very rapidly, but the ratification procedure for other international conventions might well not be so fast. So the question which we have is, what should we do in order to obtain greater convergence between the different systems? Commissioner Reichert earlier spoke of the differences of other systems, and the solutions which I've listed here have been posited, but convergence is difficult because the advances in other countries are not as rapid as we may think. And so people have begun to speak. Some people have begun to speak of interoperability, as if this were a more modest goal compared with convergence, and have begun to ask themselves how it would be possible to acquire this interoperability. Would it be simply through mutual recognition of different systems, or would more substantial steps forward be necessary? These are examples contained in the instruments I mentioned before, where we start from the point of view that the judicial system is different, but attempts are made to make steps forward in the area of enforcement. But as the United States, which is a strategic partner for the European Union, probably in the short term will not have any major new developments in the area of data protection at the federal level. And so that is why this important document approved in 2012 comes back to the issue of mutual recognition and assesses their effect, indicating that the values with the United States we share common values with the United States, but the methods used to pursue them are different. And so we have a less ambitious approach. What is Europe doing in the meantime? Commissioner Reichert spoke of this package, which is a very substantial one and moving ahead. The Italian presidency now have a very important task, which is to achieve a result before the end of the presidency, and here we have a number of very important reasons to have an approach of this kind. In 1990, the Italian Authority for Privacy, headed by Professor Rodotà, held an international conference in Venice, which concluded with a declaration entitled One World, One Privacy. What can we do today in order to obtain this worldwide protection? Do we need a legally binding instrument which is valid for all countries, which would therefore be subject to a signing and ratification procedure? How long would that procedure take? Can we make use of the solution of a legal instrument set up under the aegis of the United Nations, setting out in detail the rights to data protection and privacy as enforceable human rights? Or could we have an intergovernmental conference which could lead to a solution? Other people have indicated that more modest goals should be pursued on the basis of universally accepted standards without the need for ratification process, the Madrid standards, or else even more modestly, a universally accepted ISO privacy standards. These are all positions which are valid. Perhaps it won't be necessary to just take one on board and dispose of all the others. What is certain is that the Google case, which the previous speaker has discussed, shows that when there are transboundary situations, as in that case, the legal systems find it difficult to operate. The Coster-Gonzalez case was easily resolved by the court because many of the features were national in nature. The newspaper La Vanguardia was in that case Spanish. The data protection agency which took a decision was Spanish, and the further judgment was also took part in Spain. Let's think of a case of a publisher who is located in another country, and an event happening in another country, and a challenge brought in a third country. What would be the problems in deciding who would have the competency to decide on the case? So we can all try and see that how, in the area of data protection, not just privacy, or how we can improve a global approach. The authority I represent is very supportive of the reform being discussed in Brussels for the reasons outlined here. And certainly because of the changes which have occurred with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, a new article in the Lisbon Treaty on the new fundamental right to protection of individual data. It's a fragmentary system. Is no longer possible. We have a system which strengthens the rights of stakeholders, focuses on the accountability of people who process data. There are some flaws in consistency, particularly because of division among two legal instruments, but it is a major opportunity to have authoritative standards vis-à-vis the rest of the world. Why? Because this reform will apply to anybody in the world, even the information technology giants providing services and products to people living in the European Union, not necessarily nationals of the European Union, or which have methods to follow up a person. It doesn't necessarily need to be a negative action. And here I'm referring to an article according to which all companies which investigating authorities of other countries located outside the European Union to provide information will have to do that to will have to contact the data protection agency before providing this information. You all recall the SWIFT case and the issues which this raised. The Council is discussing a reformulation of this article, and this is an important point which remains to be considered. Among the challenges, now moving towards my conclusion, the reform will have to face up to. There are some points which I think are worthwhile discussing today. First of all, this European reform will lead to considerable progress in the area of harmonization, but it won't harmonize all rules. Certainly the national provisions, which are substantially a photocopy of the European regulation, will have to be repealed, but some national provisions will remain in force, particularly in areas such as e-government and healthcare, journalism, where the legal systems of member countries are more diverse, or where it has been decided to give more scope to member states. Let us just think of e-governance. What will happen in this area? Second challenge is that on the one hand there's a momentum towards certainty of law and no reduction of guarantees, and having clear provisions, as well as a concern about reduction in levels of protection, and at the same time we're moving towards big data, and we will need to have provisions which are stable and neutral over time for the society which we will have at least till 2025. We can't think of these rules being reviewed before that date. And we have the problem of big data, in which we don't only have personal data. In italic, we have quoted a White House document which was published this year, which tries also to consider the advantages of big data, but also the risks in relation to surveillance and protection. The European authorities have said that big data is an important challenge, but it does not mean that the principles in discussion should be re-examined. Probably we don't have all the answers to deal with the ethical issues in big data. This is just a summary of the difficulties we have, and which we'll have in the short term in order to apply these discussions in Brussels. So when our representative bodies, Council and Parliament, try to find a consensus on a reform which has now been discussed for a long time, these principles are beginning not so much to be strained, but I think we really need to think about how to apply them. If we think of the of technological development and how easy it's going to be to identify people starting from anonymous data. If we think of the clarity of roles, there will be an unlimited possibility of processing this data, making use of software which will be able to develop even in ways unforeseen and uncontrolled by their designers. And there will be modes of information which will flow into a big box and which will concern lots of people altogether. And this would lead to an aggregate picture of ours, which will lead to further discussion. So I leave you with this conclusion, where in general, and this is the position of all the authorities of the 28 EU members, we need to deal with this issue as Europe. We need to focus on the existing principles, but we also need to be able to see how these can be applied practically and effectively. And we need to find innovative and practical ways to apply these measures, which should lead to the international dissemination of a European digital habeas corpus. And so I think that the discussion today and the idea of making the draft public is an initiative which should be commended. Belgium, a very important country in Europe, has taken a very important political decision in this area by appointing a Minister for Privacy. So this is perhaps the first example, and it shows that alongside the issue of fundamental rights, this is one of the main frontiers of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very insightful and comprehensive presentation, and thank you for the extreme honesty that you have shown in listing the difficulties that have to be addressed in the context of transnational and national protection of data. Now, Guido Scorza from the University of Bologna. He is professor specialized in digital technologies. Thank you very much, Chairperson. Thank you for the invitation. I think that I have been privileged to have been able to attend such a unique, extraordinary meeting, something that we will remember for a long time to come, given that we've been talking about being remembered or not. And I say this because we believe that the draft declaration stating fundamental rights within the framework of the Internet is a truly historic milestone. And this is the result of the work of a committee that was set up within the parliamentary context, but we know that this committee has benefited from the contribution of experts from civil society. The title of my presentation already indicates what my ambition is, and allow me to thank Mr. Rodota, who chaired this committee and who is present here with us today. I think that the work of this committee will be remembered in history. It is late, and I imagine that a lot of people are keen to end this meeting, however interesting it may be. And I think that there is a starting point that we should all, I think, remember. The internet is not an elsewhere. We have people who are termed internet users, but we're talking about 500 million of European citizens who use the internet. Now, I believe that, as I said, today is a very special day indeed, and when we say that fundamental rights of citizens must be granted and effectively enforced even to online activities, and when it comes to, for instance, the recognition of these rights, it's essential that they have to be recognized within the internet, and I don't think I'm revealing a secret if I tell you that, in fact, the internet is pervasive. It is tentacular. We are progressively transferring pieces of our identity, of our personal identity, online. So this is, I think, the fundamental place where our rights will have to be safeguarded as citizens. Where else can we safeguard our right to personal identity, freedom of association, freedom of communication, if not online? So my point of view is that we either are ready to implement with all the necessary energy and enthusiasm the safeguarding of fundamental rights online, or else we have to surrender to the fact that Europe is going to be different. I think that we cannot afford to miss this opportunity. Otherwise, we would run the risk of not being able to safeguard the rights of citizens in the internet. And there are a few points that I would like to share with you and that I would like to focus on in the course of my presentation. Firstly, online, citizens are unwittingly surrendering, as Stefano Rodota would say, the right to have rights. Citizens are finding themselves in a position whereby human rights are no longer recognized as they ought to be. Take, for instance, the example of that exchange of bits of our personal identity that occur online as a result of the process to acquire the right to use a service in exchange for an at times unknowing provision of bits of our personal identity. And this certainly will leave its mark. There are more aspects that have to be considered and that are a source of concern, which I would like to share with you. The risk is that in the future, in the public ICT space, there will be fewer rights guaranteed. We know that there are gigantic playgrounds in our states, and these rules are being imposed. In fact, there is indeed no rule that is more enforced than so-called terms of use of providers of online services. No one in the world, I think, can claim that they have successfully enforced their rights vis-à-vis citizens as much as global service providers. This isn't true of Europe, it isn't true of any country. And as an observer of the internet, I cannot but affirm that the state is stepping back from its lawmaking role in terms of regulating interactions and transactions. Private rules are prevailing in terms of establishing the terms and conditions of professional relationships and negotiations. Everything is governed by the principles of business and not by the principles of democracy, and that must be a source of concern. And then there's a third consideration I wish to make that makes me say that when we talk about an Internet Bill of Rights, we're simply saying that human rights and the rights of citizens have to be guaranteed in the future in the name of security, in the name of certain rights such as copyright. We're rapidly seeing the acceptance of the fact that all that is technically possible to solve a problem ought to be considered as lawful and politically acceptable. Obviously, that is not the case. Having this belief means that we're abdicating our right to govern the system. And I would like to illustrate this statement with 3 examples. In France, Parliament is about to approve the so-called anti-terror law, which would attribute to the Ministry of the Interior the power to block, through internet service providers, access to certain content. In Turkey, the Constitutional Court has, fortunately, declared as illicit, unlawful, a provision that gave the competent authority the possibility of removing content. In Italy, administrative judges have invested the Constitutional Court with a case of legitimacy to establish whether our independent communications authority is responsible for the removal of content online in order to guarantee copyright, or to leave it online. I think that there is an urgent need for action on our part, and European citizens require an Internet Bill of Rights. Today, whether we realized it or not, I think we witnessed the birth of the initial seeds of this Internet Bill of Rights. An Internet Bill of Rights in which citizens can find solutions to the problem of seeing their rights upheld and respected in the Internet. I would like to add a few more remarks, and I obviously look forward to the debate. And in closing, allow me to share with you some of the fundamental principles that need to be included in the Internet Bill of Rights of our country and the European continent. Firstly, every citizen should have equal right to access to the Internet, and we need to have a neutral system without any discrimination on the Internet. And this is a prerequisite. It's not even a right, because in our information society, lack of access to the Internet in a non-discriminatory fashion means that individuals cannot enjoy any other right nor any other freedom. And then there is another principle which I believe we cannot afford to set aside that at least fundamental rights in the country of destination of any online service are complied with. So it's mandatory compliance of at least fundamental rights in the country of destination of any online service. There should be no market approach that allows that a European citizen be denied fundamental rights whilst using a service provided by an entity in another country. And then another fundamental right, which I believe requires very careful attention. Any restriction on the use of the internet is inexorably restriction on personal freedom, because in the information society, every human action, every action on the part of a citizen has a necessary precondition: electronic communication, and therefore any restriction placed upon European citizens and denying them freedom to communicate electronically is a form of restriction of personal freedom. So we have to imagine a new article for the Convention on Human Rights, summarizing the content of Article 5 on the right to freedom, right to liberty and security, Article 10, freedom of expression, Article 11, freedom of assembly and association. So all these freedoms in an information society require freedom in terms of electronic communication. If that is denied, all other rights are denied. Previous speakers have already, far better than I could, stressed the importance of privacy and the protection of personal identity in our information society. And this means that I can skip some of the points I intended to make. Others have made them before me. There's no doubt that in the Internet Bill of Rights, which I imagine online domicile, including the cloud, which we talk about, is to be safeguarded. It is inviolable. And certainly, now that I'm approaching the end of my time allotment, there's one last remark that I would like to make. And this is certainly not a minor point. This is the last subject I have time to address at this point. We need to review Article 17 of the Convention, which is about prohibition of abuse of rights, because abuse of rights in our time and age on the internet is common. Day after day, we witness episodes of self-justice, and in the name of some rights, the rights of others are repressed. And it's almost as if the code, the software code, which controls all platforms, is progressively replacing codes, i.e. the laws that govern us. The difference between the code software and the codes laws is that the code is developed in a business context, whereas codes are written to guarantee democracy. And so I would much rather be governed by codes than by a code. I feel more guaranteed if my rights are protected by laws, our codes, than by software, the code. And this is an essential aspect. No one will be able or should be able to abuse others' rights. So there should be no abuse of rights. Codes or laws must have a more preeminent role than the code or software. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Terminato appunto l'intervento.
So we finished the keynote speeches, and I wish to thank all of the keynote speakers for their input. I'm now opening the discussion. We already have people on the list, and so I will give people 4 minutes to comment, because there may be other people on the list. The first person, Cezary Tomczyk from Poland.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, for the first, thank you for such interesting topic. I think it's very modern and very interesting, really. The simplest definition of privacy was formulated over 100 years ago in USA, and it says that the privacy is the right to be let alone. And although with the passage of time changed, the approach to the right to privacy's essential elements remain unchanged. We are faced with a challenge that requires the establishment of modern, coherent and uniform framework for data protection in the EU, which will enable the development of digital economy to the internal market, ensure individuals' control over their own data and improve legal certainty for economic operators and public authorities. The proposed standards should increase responsibility of data administrators for the treatment of personal data. One of the innovations in the legislation on personal data protection is to enable data subject to remove information concerning his person, which has already been released to network. In the context of this law should be mentioned the judgment of the Court of Justice of European Union. Mr. Marko Ilesic told us about a few very interesting things about the Google Spain, and Court of Justice recognized the right of individuals to remove personal data subject to certain conditions. So we have, like I said before, the right to be let alone, and this is still a very important thing. And now also we have a right to be forgotten. For example, in Poland, a few hundred people sent a request to Google after May. I wonder how it looks like in Italy and other countries. In relation to the facts, uniform legal framework will help build the potential of digital market that will improve economic growth, innovation, and will help create new jobs. Regulation will put an end to the fragmentation of the legal system of the 27 member states and remove barriers to enter the market. And I think I could say that I would like to live in the time when we can trust the internet. More trust in internet means more trade in internet. More trade in internet means more jobs and big growth in economy. So I could say for the end that, like Mr. Skoza said, we need an Internet Bill of Rights, because the real trust in the Internet would be then if the citizens have the rights in the global network. Thank you.
Grazie. Grazie.
Thank you. Not least because you stuck to the time allotment. Over to Burhan Kutsutek.
Sunumlardan dolayı.
Dear Secretariat, we are thankful for the very valuable presentations.
Kişisel veri en basit anlamıyla belirli veya kimliği belirlenebilir bir kişiye ilişkin bütün bilgileri ifade eder.
In simplest terms, personal data refers to all sets of concepts that can be traced to a specific individual who is traceable and detectable.
Kişisel bilgileri vermemek elimizde değildir. Nüfusta kaydımız var, tapuda bir takım kayıtlarımız var, internette, yolculukta kayıtlarımız var. Bu bakımdan bu bilgileri vermeme diye bir lüksümüz yok.
It is inevitable for individuals not to give his or her personal information because we are all registered at the state level of a database built by the state authorities.
Bütün mesele bunları kötüye kullanıp kullanmaması meselesi. Dijital alanda yeni tehlikeler ve sanal ortamdaki kişi haklarının korunması bu işi zorlaştırmaktadır.
The point is to preserve this data and prevent it from being manipulated or used for other evil purposes. But the point is to preserve and keep this personal data in a safe way.
Özellikle terör alanındaki yeni gelişmeler devletleri teyakkuz haline getirmekte, daha tedbirli olarak birçok kişi şüpheli olarak incelemeye almaktadır.
Especially in the developments in some areas related to terrorist activities, the states are getting increasingly alerted and this situation pushes them to be more defensive.
Devletler veya kişiler farklı kullanma durumunda bu verileri, kişisel bilgileri yapılması gereken herhalde tazminat hukuku, başta olmak üzere ceza alanında bir takım cezalandırma tekniklerine gitmektir.
And this definitely requires some new techniques in criminal law, especially when it comes to punishing and judging the people who are committed in such activities.
Bu bağlamda baktığımız zaman Avrupa Birliği müktesebatında ve düzenlemelerinde bu alanın çok net bir şekilde olmadığını görüyoruz. Güvenceli bir alan olmadığını görebiliyorum. Ve insan hakları evrensel bildirgesi olsun, Avrupa İnsan Hakları Sözleşmesi olsun, bunlara dolaylı olarak değinmiş bu meseleye. Doğrudan bu konuyu inceleyen sadece bir belge var. O belgeye de baktığımız zaman o da Avrupa Konseyi'nin düzenlediği yeni bir belge.
When it comes to specifically taking these issues, especially from the national security perspective, I can't see any tangible document or a concept, in particular European Declaration of Human Rights and also Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think the EU and the other Western concepts should take this notice in more serious manner.
Avrupa Birliği'nin direktif ve tüzüğü çerçevesinde bazı tedbir alınması öngörülmüş. Ama daha çok bu konu Avrupa Birliği Adalet Divanı'nın kararlarıyla belli olmaya başlamıştır.
The tendency towards taking some concrete steps have been seen in some rulings of European Court of Justice.
Bu manada ilgili direktif ve denetlemeler, denetleyici düzenlemeler yani tüzük vesaire bu konuda bütün Avrupa Birliği ülkelerinde yeni bir takım kurullar kurulmasını öngörüyor.
Such steps foresee the establishment of new institutions in the EU members.
Ama kuruldaki üyelerin nitelerini saymamış. Bu konuda Avrupa Birliği Adalet Divanı'nın bazı kararları var. Objektif ve tarafsız olması gerektiğini, dış etkilerden bağımsız olması gerektiğini kurul üyelerinin siyasi etkisi dışında kalması gerektiğini karara bağlamış.
But this legislation does not provide any specific definition for such institutions, such as of whom these will be comprised of, under what circumstances and regulations they will operate.
Bilgi çağında toplanan bu veriler, kişisel veriler ekonomik olarak kullanıldığı için sonuç itibariyle kişinin verisinin korunmasıyla bundan yarar sağlayan gruplar arasındaki dengede kişinin kaybettiğini görüyoruz.
Unfortunately, we observe that in the equation where the individual and the economic interests have clashed, unfortunately we see that the individual is on the losing side when it comes to make economic benefits of the information.
Teşekkür ederim.
Thank you all.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Thank you, and over to Baroness Joyce Quinn.
I wanted just to begin by making a comment on the draft declaration on internet rights that we have in front of us, which I feel makes some very good points about the need for protecting people and safeguarding their rights in the digital age. And I think follows on very well from the presentations that we've had this afternoon. It is a challenging area, however, because the internet does have a life of its own and develops in unexpected ways. Certainly, since the 1995 directive was introduced, life has changed very considerably indeed. But despite those challenges, people and our citizens have rights, and they need to have redress, particularly when information about them is inaccurate, false, even defamatory. I had put down to speak before I heard Judge Ileshish talk about the European Court of Justice and the Google Spain case, and I found what he had to say very illuminating. But I did want to point out to colleagues that the House of Lords did do a report on data protection, including on the so-called right to be forgotten. And what the committee did was express concern that to give people a sort of a blanket right to be forgotten, while we understood the motivations behind it, might well be very difficult to enforce and could be unworkable in the current situation. At the very least, we needed to confront the difficulties before finalising a new directive. Once information which is accurate, even though it may be old, and lawfully available, is out on the net, it is very difficult to delete it totally from the system. And if I understood what the judge said correctly, that it was possible to remove a reference relating to doing a search on a particular individual, but that didn't mean that the information couldn't be found anywhere after a particular search. And I think that does show what a challenge we face in this sphere. And as Senior Buttarelli said, we have to try and ensure that we're not surprised by rapid developments. Let me say I'm not proposing a specific amendment to the text that we have in front of us, which I think is a good text. I simply wanted to draw attention to the work of my colleagues on this issue and say that the report that they'd done was available, which does deal with the difficulty of exercising people's rights in this particular instance. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Ahmet İmaya.
Teşekkür ediyorum. Divanı tekrar değerli üyelerle birlikte saygıyla selamlıyorum.
Thank you, and I would like to greet the Honorable Secretariat once again.
Tabii yüksek heyet 5 saattir çok kaliteli beyin proteinini tattı.
The participants and the other members have enjoyed a very qualified brainstorming under this chamber.
Yorucu bir çalışma, ancak ben bu çalışmaya, şu andaki gündem konusuna sosyal medya açısından bir katkıda bulunmak istiyorum.
And I would like to individually contribute to this exchange of views in terms of social media.
Dijital teknoloji bugün insanlığa çok büyük fırsatlarla birlikte kendi özgürlük alanını tahrip edecek tehlikeler de sunuyor.
Today, the digital technology provides unique opportunities for human freedom, but on the other side, it has the potential to pose a significant threat to the human liberties.
Sayın Scroza ve Buttarelli'nin değerlendirmelerini, akademik tahlillerini zevkle izledim.
I highly benefited the academic perspectives brought by Mr. Scorza and Mr. Buttarelli.
2-3 hususa özellikle işaret etmek istiyorum.
And I would like to draw your attention to 2 or 3 points in particular.
Dijital alan teknolojisiyle olmasa bile hukukuyla henüz yeni oluşmakta olan bir alan.
Digital platform is a newly growing area, especially with its newly built legal structure.
Yeni oluşan alanlarda normatif düzenlemeler pek tavsiye edilmez.
In such newly growing areas, the normative regulations are not recommended.
Oluş sürecinde oluşturulan ilkeler buza yazılan yazılar gibi olur bazen.
During such initial phases, the recommendations and the proposals brought by are no more than writing on the water.
Doğrusu içtihatların gelişimine bıraktıktan sonra alan belli bir birikime ulaştıktan sonra normatif düzenlemeye gitmektir.
After the jurisprudences and other practices have obtained their own common ground, it will be best to build the main legal structure.
Sosyal medya alanında daha çok haklar üzerinde duruyoruz. Bu doğru değil. Sorumluluklar ve riskler üzerinde de durmamız lazım.
When it comes to social media, we put our emphasis on rights, but we also need to focus on responsibilities and rights to be protected.
Özellikle medya zemini olan interneti işleten kişinin, tüzel kişinin veya gerçek kişinin ülke dışında olması halinde gerçekten sorumlulukların takibi bakımından çok büyük zorluklar doğuyor.
When the operator is outside of the sovereign borders of a specific country, then it becomes increasingly hard for the local authority to intercept and evaluate the responsibility and those who are potentially responsible.
Keza söz gelimi yarı geceleri saat 03'te herhangi etkili bir birim toplumu silahla sokağa çıkınız dediği zaman idarenin önlem almamasının getirdiği sosyal yıkım ve riskleri göz ardı edemeyiz.
Likewise, when an organization calls for armed rebellion in the midnight, on the other side, the state authorities cannot do anything against it to prevent, so there is something that needs to be handled at this point.
Yine bu alanda kişi hakları bakımından temel tehlikelerden birisi de istihbari olmayan adli dinlemelerdir.
And another potential threat for individual rights is that phone tappings made by only some authorities rather than justice authorities.
Bir devlet birimi içerisinde bürokrasiyle savcılık ve yargının illegal şekilde işbirliği içerisinde dinlemelerin gerçekleşmesi halinde dünya dijital faşizme dikkat çekmek zorundadır, değerlendirmek zorundadır.
The world needs to focus on the digital fascism when some circles in the bureaucracy feel themselves able to phone tapping just because of their own concerns.
Bu noktada özgürlüklerin temel güvencesi olan yargı bağımsızlığı ve yargı güvencesiyle birlikte juristokrasi tehlikelerini mutlaka değerlendirmeliyiz.
And we need to take the consideration of the danger of juristocracy, which will be imposed through some judicial organs, which can also pose threat on the freedom of the society as well.
Özgürlük alanı yalnızca anayasa alanı, yalnızca diğer düzenlemeler alanı değil, aynı zamanda yaptırımlar ve ceza hukuku alanıdır.
Area of liberty and freedom is not only related with the constitution and other legal procedures, it is also about responsibility and when it also sanctions in terms of legal possibilities.
İtalya ceza doktrini ve ceza uygulaması yargısı 1903 yılında dünyaya muhteşem bir araç sundu.
Italian criminal doctrine has presented a perfect example to the world in 1903.
Delil yasağı, bunun adı delil yasağı.
And it is mostly defined as the imposition for evidence.
Bireysel görüşüme göre adli dinlemelerin suçüstü halleri için delil değeri tanınması, dinlemelere delil değeri tanınması, onun dışında sadece yardımcı işlev yüklenmesi gerekir.
In my personal view, the phone tappings made by the judicial channels can only have impact if they are based on responsible.
Tabii zor bir konuyla, sorunla, işin doğasından kaynaklanıyor. Yoksa zihnin çözüm üretememesinden değil. Zor bir, tabiatı tam anlaşılamamış, zor bir sorunla karşı karşıyayız.
The nature of this issue is indeed complex, so we are not in a position to fully understand and perfectly evaluate it.
Dünya hukuk öğretisinin, Venedik Komisyonu'nun, İnsan Hakları Avrupa Mahkemesi'nin ve Avrupa Komisyonu Mahkemesi'nin ve şu andaki değerli komisyonun bu konuda büyük görevleri var.
And this delegation, as well as the Venedik Commission and other European legal structures, have a high responsibility in regulating this area according to the priorities of the countries.
Çok saygılar sunuyorum.
Presenting my due respect.
Adesso è Soteris.
Soteris Samson now has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Internet knows of no national boundaries, right? And it is there, and it therefore demands an international response. This in turn raises questions and new complex legal issues, especially when one takes into consideration Internet's open-ended structure and the never-ending changing and evolving technology, which makes it next to impossible to create an effective long-term legal framework to regulate it. I assume that the basic legal question to be dealt with is the very nature of the legal framework desired to be put in place. Should the priority be placed on the protection of users, or should their rights be limited because ensuring security and preventing the
Possiamo riprovare?
Can we try again?
Forse può provare.
Could you try, shall we move on? Move on with, can you try another microphone nearby, perhaps? A different microphone.
Proviamo.
Let's try. Thank you.
Shall I start from the beginning or shall I continue?
Da dove si era fermato va bene.
From where you were is fine, I think.
So as I was saying, what it comes down to is whether we want to turn the European Union into a vast police state or whether we really want to protect the fundamental individual rights of the users. The Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice, in the joint cases C293 and 594, 2012, has greatly contributed to the process of creating a new legal framework by laying down a set of essential principles to be adhered to. We respectfully submit that a balance should be achieved between the need to combat crime and the necessity to protect individual rights of the Internet users, with the latter, of course, unquestionably being of higher moral and ethical value than the former, and in full accordance and harmony with any concept of the rule of law. Other than what Mr. Buttarelli and Mr. Scorza mentioned in their interventions, with which I agree fully, at the very least, I propose that in any effort to create a new legal framework, we should take into consideration at least the limitation of fundamental rights should only apply insofar as it is strictly necessary. EU law must lay down clear and precise rules governing the scope of these limitations and the safeguards for individuals. There is a need to implement substantive conditions, such as an objective criterion by which the number of people authorized to have access to this data is set, or a procedural criterion such as review by an administrative authority or a court prior to access to this data is given, or more importantly, the time span within which this data can be retained and used by the authorities. In light of the above, in concluding, in light of the above, As a general principle, we concur with the draft declaration, and we strongly believe that any new European legal framework and initiative should reflect the long-established European values, and in no way should it lead to a regression of the protection of these rights, liberties, and dignity of the net users as currently afforded by the EU member states. Thank you.
Grazie. Riza Turmen.
Thank you. Over to Mr. Turmen.
Well, it is quite true that the internet, the use of internet, raises many questions, sensitive legal questions. It does transcend national boundaries. It does demand an international response. This is all very true. But we should not forget that internet freedom is part of freedom of expression, and surveillance of the states over personal data is dangerously increasing. We should be very aware of this danger for personal freedoms, for the freedom of expression. And when we're talking about restrictions under one excuse or another to be brought to this internet freedom, we should also be clear about the safeguards that such restrictions should contain, should entail. In this context, the Court of Justice's recent judgment declaring the Data Retention Directive to be invalid is an important decision because it does contain specific safeguards. The judgment is based on the generalized manner of the directive. It encompasses all individuals, all means of electronic communication. The directive fails to lay down any objective criterion. The directive, the court says, as far as the period is concerned, is not acceptable, and it does not have sufficient safeguards to ensure effective protection against the risk of abuse. Now, all these criterion are not very much different from the Rotaro versus Romania judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. My good friend and colleague, Maruste from Estonia, he knows this judgment very well. He was a sitting judge, as well as I was a sitting judge at this judgment. This judgment lays down the limits on the exercise of restrictions. It does say, it does find a violation of Article 8 of right to privacy on the ground that the domestic law does not define the kind of information that may be recorded, the categories of people against whom surveillance measures may be taken, the circumstances in which such measures may be taken, and the length of time. It is on these grounds that the European Court of Human Rights found a violation. But what is important in this judgment, I think more important, is that the court says that secret surveillance to be compatible with Article 8, right to privacy of the Convention, they must contain safeguards established by law which apply to the supervision of the relevant services activities. And it says supervision procedures must follow the values of a democratic society. In particular, the rule of law, which is expressed in the Convention. That the interference of the executive authorities with an individual's rights should be subject to effective supervision, which should normally be carried out by the judiciary. So when we're talking about supervision of the safeguards, we should leave room for the judiciary to be part of it. In Turkey, the situation is not very bright. All these criterions that I have mentioned are not included in the law which is effective right now. Under the law that we have on internet, the content providers, service providers are obliged to submit all traffic data to the Telecommunications Presidency, which is a government agency, without a court decision. And in this way, the government agency has a limitless access to personal data. Now, this should be read together with the intelligence agency law, because intelligence agency in Turkey has the power to get to obtain every kind of information from every source. And
La invito a concludere.
yeah, so this is the situation. And one last thing, in the progress report of the European Union on this issue, it says that, first of all, Turkey must adopt a general law on the protection of personal data in line with Council of Europe's Convention on Data Protection. And secondly, there needs to be an independent data protection authority, which doesn't exist now in Turkey. Thank you very much.
Allora, adesso
Diego De Laurentiis now has the floor.
Sì, grazie Presidente.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I am taking the floor in this forum, first of all, to thank the eminent speakers and also the discussants. I am speaking as a member of the committee which drafted that document to reiterate that that document is obviously a draft, because in the space of a few months it wasn't possible to do a deal comprehensively with all the issues which are being brought up here. In fact, many of the points which have been made here were the subject of discussion at our meetings in preparing the draft. This is something which reassures me, because it shows that the same discussion is being held on many issues in many countries. However, I think it was right to issue a very strong signal from the institutions, of our attention to these issues. It would not be acceptable for public opinion not to receive a sign that these are central issues for the institutions too. We hope that the public consultation, which will last 4 months, in line with the European ones, will make it possible to enrich and supplement this document. And I'm saying this because there are entire chapters, such as intellectual property rights, which haven't been mentioned deliberately in this document, because these are issues which are obviously political in nature too. And so in that forum, no consensus position was achieved. We hope that from the public consultation, new items will emerge which will allow us to supplement the document. I will certainly be relaying your positions to our group, so as to include all the points which have been brought up in our discussion there. I also want to take advantage of being here to raise another point. It may seem to be paradoxical, but in Italy, it was in Italy that we find ourselves drafting this document. Italy is one of the last countries to have widespread access to the internet and broadband access, and it will therefore probably take some time between the enunciation of principles and the real enjoyment of rights on the part of the population. But this is not should not excuse us from trying to steer a path, and we have followed a path which has already been built by others. We referred to the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union because we believe that digital citizenship is not totally disconnected from the other dimensions of citizenship, but it is a further dimension, and it is a dimension which should make it possible to extend inviolable human and civil rights of all people, and not just in the European Union. Thank you also for this input from the working group, and the last person on my list is Deborah Schimbri.
And thanks for the very lively discussion. It's always good to have rights. It's also good to have, obviously, digital rights. And usually when we speak in the language of rights, we tend to remember very much who is using those rights, the individual rights of people using the internet, but we tend to forget a little bit the rights of victims who are victims of those users, and therefore sometimes a balance is not struck between the two. And I would like us all to remember that the internet can be the source of things that are very good for a lot of people, but also it can be the source of anguish to people who are victims of abuse on the internet. And therefore, when we speak of rigorously giving rights to users, we should also think of rigorously regulating abuse of those rights. Vulnerable people are constantly being bullied on the internet, including children. And therefore, we have a very vulnerable group that needs to be taken care of. It is also a group of people who are being basically attacked in the most private areas of their lives, in their homes. Usually, traditionally, bullying was in the schoolyard. It was there, and you went out of the schoolyard and you escaped it. But now, when it comes to the internet, it is where you usually escape to that the bullying is actually happening. And therefore, we need to be very, very careful of regulating abuse. The sheer dimension of the internet makes a problem millionfold, because before, if it was just a couple of people bullying you in the schoolyard, it was 2 people. Now, that same bullying is taken on the internet, and a lot of people actually aggregate against a child, and that child feels so vulnerable that we have had children losing their lives over it, and it has become that serious. We need to protect our children, but not only our children, even adults are being attacked on the internet. And as a lawyer in private practice, I do family law, and I find that a lot of vulnerability, there is a lot of vulnerability with domestic abuse cases that are taken over to the internet, and people are continuously attacked. People have been losing jobs because an aggravated husband or wife actually goes and says things that aren't true on the internet. And therefore, we need to be even protective of our adults, not just our children. It is true that we don't want to be a police state. It is true that we don't want to be overburdened with too many laws and regulations. However, when you realize that when abuses on the internet take place, they are very difficult to get hold of, and they are very difficult to reverse, then we need to really think hard of what kind of punishment that deserves, especially if we're going to give rights that are ample. We should also take note of regulating abuses very harshly. Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Thank you. Before we hand over to the speakers, May I say that this has been an extremely interesting and insightful debate on a topic that is anything but easy to address, and there are two additional questions that I would like to ask. Firstly, after the Google Spain ruling, which established some important principles, and considering the European Commission's data protection package propositions, do we still feel the need for the European Union's legislation to include the decisions of various courts? Does case law, in other words, have to feature in European legislation at this point? And the second question, or rather a comment, given that the European Union is hoping to review and update its legislative framework, don't you think that the European Union can successfully overcome the concerns of some countries, such as the United States and others, encouraging them to use more balanced solutions, to see users as persons and not as consumers, so that democratic concerns can prevail over commercial concerns? These are just additional thoughts that I would like to share with you. The debate is ongoing, and I'm happy to be able to join you in this discussion on something which is obviously still of interest to our respective parliaments. We have, in fact, a request for the floor from a senator. Francesco Campanella from the Italian Senate has the floor.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the speakers and Ms. Baldrini and the Parliamentary Committee for the work that it has done. In the Italian Senate, we're working on similar projects. There is a draft bill on the subject of access to the internet, and this would refer to the Constitution. We're talking about an economic space here, and we're also, however, talking about an economic and political space, because it's not just about business and commerce, but it's also about decision-making and politics. Currently, we know that there is a political movement in Parliament in Italy at the moment, which, as a rule, uses the internet massively in order to engage with citizens. So far, however, we have seen a free-for-all. I mean, in other words, there seem to be no rules in this context, and I think something ought to be done to regulate this, because so far rules have been set by the providers. It's hard to regulate the internet because it changes constantly and it grows and develops in unpredictable fashion. But if we don't regulate, then the most powerful players will establish their rules. We know that internet users have to accept contracts that are imposed upon them. Simply put, they couldn't use services unless they accept these contracts. So our efforts should be that of regulating the entire subject, starting with the issue of access. A colleague pointed out that Italy is lagging behind in this field. If we think of the internet as being a real space, as a space which every citizen should have a right to, also in terms of being a social being, at this point, it would be necessary to regulate and to make an effort to do this, to guarantee access. And this could be done gradually. We're not suggesting that this process should necessarily involve all states or many states at the same time. What we're saying is that gradually, just as individual countries have developed their systems guaranteeing more access, in some cases less access in the other, the idea is that gradually states could undertake to give citizens appropriate access to the internet so that they can produce, establish relations with others, and enjoy the various rights and facilities that are available. Thank you. Now back to the speakers. It's following the same order. Marco Ilesic, Giovanni Buttarelli, and Guido Scorza.
Grazie. Just a few words for the conclusion. I will repeat what I said an hour ago, that the Court of Justice of the European Union is not a human rights court. So it's not its principal task to defend human rights. The court was established and it keeps the role of balancing different rights as to the European law. So there is no priority to human rights. There are other human rights and other interests in the European Union, in the European Union law, that should be respected. So I know that being a high supporter of human rights idea, it's modern and it's necessary. But you must also think of other rights that exist. And if you have a look to the Google case, I take it as an example, we have been balancing the two, let's say, human rights concerning individuals, Article 7 of the Charter, right to private and private life, and Article 8, data protection, with two other rights, which are not that much close to an individual, or right. The Article 11, right to information and to free expression, is also linked to the individual. But the right existing in the Article 16, right to conduct business, is more or less an economic right. So we pulled out a balance which at the end brought us to the decision as it is. And I'm sorry, but I still find out that the judgment is not very well understood. For example, Mr. Tomczyk, bardzo przepraszam, but you mentioned the right to be forgotten, which is not included in the judgment. You read it thoroughly. We never, at no place, talk about this right. We didn't establish a new right. It is mentioned in the judgment as observations of the parties involved, but not as the opinion of the court. I am glad that Mrs. Quinn understood it correctly. The only, I don't understand, of course we are proud, we are happy, we are human beings, if anybody likes our judgments. But we are not, it's not our function to be loved by people. We have to decide on not always very agreeable conflicts. And I would invite you, and I'll terminate with this, to read together, so in order to understand it. A part of our dispositive of the judgments, the directives must be interpreted as meaning that the operator of a search engine is obliged to remove from the list of results displayed following, I underline, a search made on the basis of a person's name links to web pages published by third parties and containing information relating to that person. That's all we said. You must Google. You must remove from the lists of results a search made on the basis of a person's name. So the idea is it's not allowed, it's contrary to the both basic rights of Article 7 and 8 of the Charter, that you can, by clicking a name of a person, get out of the search engine a complete profile of this person. But of course, the information itself, and as in the case in question, the publication of a certain procedure from 15 years or 14 years ago is not touched by the case. So, as I said, I would like that the court would be, or it would be perhaps good that the court would be a legislator, but it's not, and we take account of this. Thanks.
Grazie.
Thank you. Giovanni Buttarelli, over to you. Thank you very much, Chairperson. This has been not just a very interesting debate, it's also been extremely encouraging. And many of the points that have been made don't need any response from me. There would appear to be widespread agreement on the nature of new rights for the protection of personal data and privacy. These could be termed as new generation rights, the full extent of which still remains to be seen. And these rights are linked to so-called positive obligations that the European Court of Human Rights has indicated as being guaranteed by the Convention. So both on account of the European Convention on Human Rights and on account of the Lisbon Treaty, not only is there the obligation to be proportional in introducing limitations to these rights, but it is also necessary to act positively through the combined effect of both regulations and actions on the part of the competent authorities so as to establish the necessary premises for the development of these rights and avoid their further erosion. Another conclusion is that these rights are not absolute, but obviously they require an adequate balance with other freedoms, such as freedom of expression and other rights and duties, rather, that are the result of our being part of a community.
One third consideration is that the so-called right to be let alone is really something of the past. If we think of administering all our life, managing our lives through tablets and smartphones, and doing that with e-government, the idea of being on our own, left alone in such a modern, contemporary world is rather far-fetched. And so it's not so much a question of being able to express consent in all cases, but supervision to allow citizens to carry out control dynamically in order to see whether the use of the data goes beyond a certain threshold or clashes with the principles which will need to establish a minimum common denominator. I also heard with great satisfaction the comment of a number of delegates who said that substantial and procedural clarity is required, both with regard to protective measures and with regard to any waivers or exceptions. And this clarity also has to apply to the protection of other rights. And cyberbullying was a very good point in case. On our website, we've carried out an analysis on the interaction between cyberbullying and the protection of children and the protection of data in a wider sense. And to answer the points made by the chair with regard to the Google case, I agree completely with the opinion of the previous speaker. This judgment did not introduce ex novo the right to be forgotten, which did exist in our country's legislations in differing ways. It's certainly not something which has emerged because of the decision. The decision contains a number of points which are already supported by the data protection agencies, but perhaps the only innovative point is the possibility for a person involved to contact Google directly without needing to go through a contact with the so-called source site of the information. And it will be, I think that anybody providing search engine services in the world should have to be do this in compliance with our rules and principles. And there is a global need for protection, and this reminds us of all the scenarios we've outlined in looking for the best possible global solution. But Europe will not be able to advance any credible solution internationally unless it itself is credible in removing the currently unsustainable situation of fragmentation it has in its midst, and approve a reform which would place us in a very weak status internationally. A number of so-called third world countries are looking with great interest at what Europe is deciding. Our model will have an effect on many countries in the APEC area and many African countries which are now beginning to address the issue of data protection. And important players like Japan, who are now in the process of updating their legislation. This attention is not always visible, but I can assure you that there is a constant focus on our debate in the United States. Only through the approval of this reform will Europe, as you said, Chair, become a credible leader in international negotiations and be able to hold more effective discussions with strategic partners like the United States. 5 or 6 important regulatory packages, including framework agreement with law enforcement bodies, the Treaty on Trade and Partnership, the future of the so-called U.S. safe harbor, and the apparently bilateral agreements such as air travel and financial transactions, which in actual fact, when dealt with, will have a planetary effect. So despite the need to improve some of the provisions of the reform, certainly with regard to clarity, we can only exhort the European institutions to approve it, adopt it, and begin to apply it, and particularly use it for a more global solution. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Scott. It's a privilege, within a privilege, being the last speaker in such an interesting debate. And I must say that I take note of the fact that there is a European genetic, there are European genetic assets in the area of the protection of human rights. When we speak of fundamental human rights online, these can be recognized. This should make it make the path of that draft declaration of Internet fundamental rights easier. Two comments, and really two, just before I thank you. The first one is that I believe that it has come out from a number of speakers that often in the public arena on the internet, there's been the affirmation of a fundamental right followed by a necessary limitation of another fundamental right of human beings and citizens. There is a constant activity of balancing fundamental rights, which applies, and my impression is, independently of the future of the Bill of Rights, that for Internet it will be essential that the various actors who will be taking responsibility for the implementation of these measures in the European Union succeed in holding a substantial and positive dialogue, because I think there's nothing worse than an immediate future of excessive protections of certain rights to the damage of others. And one consideration on the question the chair was putting with regard to the relationship with the rest of the world on the other side of the Atlantic, it's clear that there is some cultural difference with regard to the fundamental rights of human beings and citizens on the two sides of the Atlantic, without saying that one culture is better than another. Perhaps in recent months and recent years, at times we've seen positions being taken which were adversarial. Perhaps if it were possible to synthesize positions and finding an encounter in future years, we need to stress the idea of being for something, because Internet is also a global forum where the moments and reasons for contact outweigh anything else. So even if we have a Europe protecting the fundamental rights of its own citizens, I don't think that we want to look to a Europe which enters into a clash of cultures or even civilizations with the other side of the Atlantic. What I would like to see is a Europe which makes use of its own history to try to share, in the interests of all citizens of the planet, the common genetic heritage of rights of human beings, which I heard advocated so forcefully today. Thank you. So it's been a very long day for all of us, and we've finally reached the end, and I wish to thank the keynote speakers, the discussants, and all those who for the important input. A few housekeeping announcements. There will now be a drinks will be offered in the corridor outside where we had the coffee break, and then we have a dinner offered at the restaurant of the Chamber of Deputies on the ground floor. Tomorrow morning we'll be beginning at 9 o'clock. As you know, we have a very busy schedule tomorrow, and so we would like to urge everybody to be here on time so that we can really have enough time to focus on the discussions tomorrow morning, which are devoted to equally important questions. Thank you.